In this video, I will cover the basics of the Warlock class, but I will simply be referencing the information on patrons a Warlock can choose from. As stated before, I'm changing the format of these videos so that I will cover all aspects of the base class in a single video and cover the specializations, or in this case the patrons, in videos more specific to their features. This means that while the Warlock class does choose their Patron, which defines their class specialization, at level 1, I will only be covering anything specific to the Patrons in the upcoming videos. This will ensure a given video is more focused on the topic at hand and less jumpy as in some of my previous videos. A Warlock generally yearns to gain more knowledge, usually at the expense of making a pact with an otherworldly deity or patron of some kind. These patrons can range from demons and devils all the way through to mysterious fae and even some angelic creatures of other planes. The Pact usually defines an agreement between the Warlock and the Patron, which allows that Warlock to use the powers provided by the Patron, and those pacts usually have strings attached to them that benefit the Patron more than they benefit the Warlock. As a DM, I will generally ask any player using a Warlock class character to create a basic pact and present that to me before the campaign starts. I will then use that basic concept to create the finished version of the pact itself and generally align it with the given patron the player has chosen. The pact will be linked into the overall campaign I will be putting the players through and tends to, well, let's just say, has been known to cause issues and unexpected tangents with some of those campaigns. Sometimes to the detriment of the party, sometimes to their benefit. A Warlock who forfeits their agreement with a patron will usually give up their powers, and for those who tend to make pacts with demons, they will also lose their soul when they die. However, this can sometimes be turned into an additional quest in an attempt to recover that soul, and thereby destroy the agreement or make a new pact. Warlocks, because of the pact they make at level 1, tend to be overpowered at the start of a campaign. However, over time, balance is generally restored as the character levels, and their powers tend to level off to align with other characters at the same level. In relation to the patrons themselves, there are 3 patrons a character can choose from that are provided by the player's handbook, and they are the Archfey, the Fiend, and the Great Old One. I will go into much more detail about each of those patrons in videos specific to the class specializations of that particular patron. So there won't really be a whole lot of information or references made to those patrons within this particular video. While Warlocks are considered a spellcasting class, they do gain the ability to use light armor and simple weapons, but are pretty much expected to use their spells or their pact magic in relation to combat. Their saving throw proficiencies are Wisdom and Charisma, which plays quite well into the fact that the primary stat of a Warlock is Charisma. However, a good Constitution is also recommended because there is a very good chance they could be soaking up quite a bit of damage when they gain the attention of their opponent, due to the high amounts of damage they themselves will be doing to that opponent. With that, let's create a basic human Warlock who is built with the Charlatan background using the character wizard provided by Fantasy Grounds, and that is available right through the characters page here, or the PC page I should say. Just move this out of the way, and all you have to do is click on this blue star here to open up the character wizard. And I'm just going to get rid of these windows here. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the race. I'm going with human, and the languages I get 1 from the looks of it. So I already know common, which means I shouldn't need to select common. And I'm going to choose Celestial for this one. And that will tie directly into the fact that this particular individual is a Warlock. The next thing I'm going to do is configure my stats. And in this case, I want to focus on a very high Charisma, a reasonably high Constitution, and potentially provide a reasonably high Wisdom as well. So I'm going to select Dice Roll. It's going to automatically execute the roll for me and drop the 1s, and ooh, those are some horrid numbers. I will come back when I actually get some stats I'm happy with. Alright, so I finally got some stats that I can actually work with, and moving these values around is fairly easy. All you have to do is just simply click on these arrows that are literally just below each of the stats, and not really much you have to do in this particular case. I've already moved them into place. You'll note, though, that a human gets a +1 to pretty much all stats, and that is really the only race that gets that kind of a bonus. Most get a handful of points, like 1 or 2 points. For some reason, the human race always seems to get a +1 to everything, and I don't know why, but whatever, it works. And you'll note that the values that are here all have a +1 value here, and that's because of the bonus for the racial adjustment that you're getting here. Next, I will choose the class. That is going to be Warlock. And I'm going to temporarily pop over to the Charlatan background here so that I can see what I get for my skill proficiencies, and that's Deception and Sleight of Hand. That way I don't have to worry about doubling up on the actual skills here. So I want Arcana. And let's do... Gonna get that. Let's go with History. And in this particular case, I'm just going to choose the Archfey for now, but I am not going to cover much more in the way of information for that. Alright, and in relation to the background, I've already got that selected. So what I find interesting is that Deception and Sleight of Hand have not come up here. So if I do this, there we go. Now they have. Excellent. The last thing I'm going to do before I move on is make sure that I select my inventory. Your class sheet and your backgrounds are really the two locations where you're going to find your starting equipment. If you scroll down past your information table here, you will find a section called Proficiencies. Below that will be Equipment. And this will give you a complete listing of all of the equipment that you'll be starting from your class's point of view, while on the background, it will be underneath the Proficiencies subtitle here. You will see an Equipment title that is not a major title according to this particular page. And this will give you the information that your background provides for your equipment. And you'll want to make sure that you go through both of them and set everything up on your character to simplify things down the road. So in this particular case, I get the choice of a light crossbow and 20 bolts or any simple weapon. If you're unsure what is classified as a simple weapon, the class sheet has a nice set of convenient links here that you can just simply click on. And you will see that these super categories here, simple melee weapon and simple ranged weapon, will be a grouping of all of the items, if you will, that are classified as simple weapons. That doesn't matter whether you choose melee or ranged here. You could theoretically start with a light crossbow, and you can see that a light crossbow here is a simple ranged weapon. In this particular case, I am going to simply choose a quarterstaff, and I will drag that into place. Now, I could have used this character wizard here to actually search for that particular quarterstaff. So if I type in quarter, you'll notice it won't show up right away because I have the gear tag selected here, the tab I should say, not tag. But if you select weapons, you'll see that quarterstaff is here. And all you have to do is drag and drop it. But I'm not going to do that because I already have that there. And then you'll have a third tab here that is all of the weapons or armor that you'll be using, sorry. What else? So I want an arcane focus. And this is why I like using these tables, because an arcane focus here does not show up here. If you search for focus, you will not find a focus here. And that's because in this particular case, an arcane focus is referencing a category of equipment, if you will. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you go to Adventuring Gear, you will see these titles again. You'll see here Arcane Focus, and that means that it could be any one of these particular items that you wish to choose from. In this particular case, I'm going to choose a crystal. Okay, now the next thing is I want a Scholar's Pack or a Dungeoneer's Pack. Well, the one thing about a Warlock is that their primary goal is to seek knowledge. That means they're probably not doing a whole lot in the way of dungeoneering. I'm not saying it's not possible. Obviously, the class gives you the quest, or the class rather gives you the selection of choosing one of those. But for this particular character, I'm actually going to go a little bit different and search for the Scholar's Pack. So if I search for Pack, you will see that under Gear, the various packs do in fact show up. And all I have to do is drag and drop the Scholar's Pack. For those of you who are familiar with what happens with these packs, in that they will sort of explode out into all of the equipment that you see in this particular list here, you'll notice that with the Character Wizard, that doesn't happen. That's because that expansion of that particular pack, if you will, happens at the time of the creation of the character sheet. So it's not something you have to worry about right now. And the last thing I'm going to do is select my armor and any additional simple weapon and any 2 daggers. Okay, so let's go to the armors list here. I'm going to drag my armor in. And I'm going to open the weapons back up again. So it looks like I get to have 2 simple weapons and 2 daggers. So I'm going to drag 1 dagger and set that to 2. I'm going to choose, let's see, let's go with a mace. Okay, and that now finishes everything that we will get from the starting equipment, but you don't want to close your class sheet just yet. The reason being is some of the items within the background option that you choose from here might require you to open up any one of these particular tables here because it might not necessarily be clear there. Now, close, I'm going to search for here. And I get a set of fine clothes. Okay. A disguise kit. Okay. Tools of the con of your choice. I'm not going to worry too much about that because I won't necessarily be using that in this particular set of videos. But it could be anything that you do. For example, you could be a individual who is trying to sell water as medication, for example, and that could be what this is in this particular case. So it's really what is it that you as a character are creating your con. And as a dungeon master, if you're joining my campaign as part of that particular process, I'm going to want to make sure that you have something set up for that. Because the minute you get into a town, if you don't start trying to con your stuff off, or start your con, or whatever your con is going to be, I'm going to start questioning your legitimacy as a warlock. The next thing I want to look for is the dice. And in this case, I don't know if, yep, so let's see, is there an actual set of weighted dice? No, okay. So, I will just drag the dice in for now, and when I get to the character's inventory page, we'll adjust that. Actually, that is all related to your con. So you could be like a rolling dice, stuff like that. So I'm going to go with the dice for now. Belt pouch. Now, if you search for belt, you're not going to find one. But if you search for pouch, oops, provided you spell pouch correctly, there we go. You'll find that, and then you can just rename that as belt pouch, and then that will contain your actual gold. And that completes everything that we need to do for the inventory. Now, a warlock does start off with spells. So this will be the last thing that we have to do before we move on to the next section, if you will. They start off with 2 cantrips, and this particular character is starting off with 2 available spells. So I'm going to make sure that I choose my cantrips first. I'm going to go with Eldritch Blast. And I don't have a sword. Actually, is Blade Ward defensive? Yeah, that'll work. I'll go with Blade Ward. So that'll be a little bit of a defensive cantrip for me. And level 1. I'm going to go with Hex. And Hellish Rebuke. I'm going to choose those 2. And outside of the name, this particular character is pretty much ready to be created. Now, in this particular case, I'm simply going to call it Warlock. Warlock, provided I can spell today. I'm having issues with spelling today all day. So I'm not sure what happened there. I know that the character creation process did not complete, so I've reported that to Fantasy Grounds, and I've had to go through and manually recreate our Warlock character through the old method that you used to use in order to create characters, or the older method, I should say. That method still exists. There's no reason why you can't use that older method, just the wizard's a little bit more convenient. So when creating a warlock right now, I would recommend trying to simply go through and create it manually. I do have other videos for other classes that you can use as an example to be able to actually go through and create a warlock manually. So let's take a look at some of the things that we have gained when we first created the character. Typically, when you complete the character wizard phase and you save that character, you get a sheet that looks something like this. Your stats will be here, your saving throws will be here, and if you're creating the character through the character wizard, and it does in fact create the character sheet properly, just make sure that your wisdom and your charisma saving throws here are proficient. So there should be a little gold or yellow star here. And all you want to do is just click it, just to turn it so that it's proficient. And the reason for that is, up until now, the character wizard has not been setting those, so you want to make sure that you do that. The other thing it does for us is ensures that our skills are set up correctly, our ability scores, or our abilities, I should say, are added to the features list here. Our proficiencies are set, the languages are set, the inventory is set the way that we wanted it to. And if you recall, I had chosen the Scholar's Backpack. That creates this backpack and a lot of the other stuff that you see in here that I did not initially add as part of my selection. But it doesn't always set up our actions. It will go through and add in the spell slots. It will go through and add in the weapons that we have chosen. But the thing it doesn't do is it won't add any of these abilities that are actionable to this sheet. So that's the first thing that we're going to want to do. So out of all of the features that are listed, including the expanded spell list, false identity, fey presence, otherworldly patron, pact magic, and the archfey, only these three are not associated with the archfey, otherworldly patron there. So those I will be covering in another video. I'm strictly going to be focusing on what you're going to be acquiring as a basic warlock at level 1, and then working through the levels strictly only identifying and describing all of the features and things that you have to do for the basic warlock stuff. Once we get into the specializations, that's when I'll start covering the other elements that are specific to those specializations, as I've stated before. So, with that in mind, I'm going to start off with false identity. And the reason for that is that has come from the charlatan background, so it's not really specific to the actual Warlock class, if you will. This feature, false identity, gives you the ability to assume a secondary persona and identity that you have actually gone through and already created. This isn't an actionable item, other than the fact that you might want to indicate to the DM that you're making use of it. So it doesn't have to go into the Actions tab, but it is generally recommended because you're going to want to be able to quickly get at this, as well as to actually go through and indicate to the Dungeon Master that you're using it. You can do that simply by dragging it into the Actions tab here and creating a charlatan background, which I'm... So 1L, that's all I was looking for. So you create a charlatan category, and that way all you do is you click that to say, I'm going to use my alternate personality to take on this disguise, I'm going to become this person, and then you do what you want to do through the campaign. I actually had one warlock who took the charlatan thing, and they used their false identity when they first met the party, and continued to play that persona all through that campaign. And they only revealed who they actually were at the end of the campaign, and then they just simply murdered the party. So that was that was sort of an unexpected change from their perspective, but it was planned between myself and the warlock, because the campaign was getting a bit boring and they wanted to be able to go out with a bang, so they did, literally. But that's one way that you can use that, for example. Another way would be to make use of that identity when you're in a city or in a town and you don't want to be recognized as you pass through that particular city or town. At the same time, maybe you have specific cities that they only know you by that particular individual as, not necessarily the warlock that you are. So you're going to want to keep track of all of that stuff. So there's a little bit of note taking when it comes to making use of false identity and how detailed your background of your background you want it to be. So those are the kinds of things that you want to keep in mind. In relation to the Otherworldly Patron feature here, that is essentially where you are choosing the Otherworldly Patron that you're going to create a pact with. And you acquire it at first level, and this is more or less the trigger that triggers the class specialization selection. So that's all this really is. It's nothing that you're going to gain as a usable feature at this point in time. And essentially what it does is it links you directly to what your actual patron is, in this case the Archfey, and then links you into these features, which, as I said, I'll be covering in another video. So you don't need to worry too much about this one. You don't need to link it anywhere. The Pact magic feature is the feature that gives you in your Warlock class the ability to actually cast spells. So while you are a spell-casting class in this particular case, you're not a spellcaster in the normal sense of how things work. The only reason you can cast spells is because of the pact that you have made with your patron. They're granting you powers that give you the ability to cast spells. And that's essentially the definition of a warlock. If you did not have this patron pact in place, you would not be able to cast spells unless you actually went through the process of training through a wizard or mage or sorcerer's training program, if you will. Those are the kinds of things that are different and differ this particular character from all other characters. Another thing that is different is that you regain your spells during a short rest or a long rest. You're not restricted to having to take a long rest in order to actually recover your spell slots. And that is a big change when it comes to a spellcaster. You will start off with 2 cantrips, and the Warlock table shows you how many spells you start off with. So at first level, for example, you know 2 spells and you have 1 spell slot. And that spell slot level is level 1. Now, another thing that is different is that when you look at the Actions tab here, you will notice, I'm not sure where that came from, you will notice that you don't have spell slots per se, you have Pact magic slots. It essentially functions the exact same way that a spell slot does, except for the fact that you do get it back at a short or long rest, which I've already covered. But I wanted to point this out because typically in a normal spellcaster, you will see spell slots listed here, and then you'll see 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, etc., etc. In the case of a warlock, you get Pact magic, and you will get an X number of spell slots, and they will constantly change as things move along as you level your character. And the only other thing that we need to look at when it comes to the spellcasting capability of a warlock is where you go to actually get your spells. Well, on your character sheet, you will have this Pact magic link, which opens up this particular tab here. Inside of that is the Warlock spells list. And if you pop that open, it will give you a table that contains all of the spells that you can cast. And a lot of these are unique to the Warlock. They do not necessarily cross over in reference to a wizard, mage, or even in some cases a clerical component. They are pretty close to strictly a warlock. For example, Hex and Hellish Rebuke, and Arms of Hedar and Armor of Agathis, for example. You won't necessarily see those as a wizard or a clerical spell or druid spell, for that matter. Which means that you will only be able to choose from this particular table unless your class specialization dictates that you can choose from other sources. And even then, they're going to provide you those other sources. And that will cover everything that we need to go through and understand for level 1. At level 2, we're going to acquire a new feature called Eldritch Invocations. It's always a bit of a tongue twister to say. At the same time, you're going to gain the ability to know a third level spell or a third spell, and you're going to gain your second first level spell slot. At this point, you're also going to gain a new feature called Invocations, which is associated with this particular spell. And this dictates how many of those invocations you can actually use or know. So I'm going to quickly drop the level onto this particular character. I'm going to go to my Abilities tab and bring out Eldritch Invocations, and then we'll go over the details of this particular feature. And as you can see, it's a little bit extended, so I'm going to expand this out a little bit. The Eldritch Invocations feature is essentially a method that allows you to enhance the effects of spells that you are going to be making use of. It gives you the ability to choose two features, or if you will, or invocations of this particular feature is a better way to look at it, that you can potentially make use of, and really adds a little bit of punch, if you will, when it comes to some of the spells that you can do. For example, you could choose Agonizing Blast. Whenever you cast your Eldritch Blast, you can add your Charisma modifier to the damage of that particular spell whenever it hits. So that would be an example. In this particular character's case, that's an additional 4 points of damage, which could be the difference between life or death of that particular creature. And there are a lot of features that are available that you can choose from, as you can see here. It just simply goes on and on and on. There is, however, a limitation. So if you look here in this prerequisite column, you will notice that some of them actually have a limitation in place. So for example, in order for you to use Agonizing Blast, you actually have to have the Eldritch Blast cantrip. In relation to using Armor of the Shadows, there is no prerequisite. So there are a couple of things that you can benefit from here. However, this one does require you to have level 9. Meaning that your character is level 9, not that you have the ability to cast level 9 spells, because unfortunately, Warlocks don't get that ability. I think as far as they go is 5th level. Yeah, they go as high as 5th level. And so whenever you choose a feature, or sorry, an invocation, you will want to make sure that you qualify when it comes to the actual prerequisite before you choose it. And that is literally the only limitation when it comes to this particular feature. So in this particular example, I'm going to show you how you can add the benefits of some of these particular features to spells that might already be in place here. The first one I'm going to make use of, for instance, is the Agonizing Blast feature. Now, there are two ways that you can go about doing this. We already have the Eldritch Blast spell here. And if you look here, actually, it doesn't appear to... yeah, there it is. We already have the features here in order to do the damage that this particular spell is going to do. In relation to Agonizing Blast, we could simply add an effect modifier here, if you will, that tells the Dungeon Master I'm using Agonizing Blast and adding that damage to this particular roll. The other thing that you could do is actually create a whole Eldritch Invocation category and add each of these individually to that. Those are the two options that we have available to us. I'm inclined to go with the latter option, and the reason for that is because it allows you to group all of those separate adjustments, if you will, into one particular category. But it's not a set in stone option, so I'm going to show you both methods here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new effect to Eldritch Blast. And if I do that, I just go through here, and in this case I'm going to be adding damage. I'm then going to modify the damage. And what this is it's going to be a bonus of 4. Actually, you don't even need to do that. All you have to do is Charisma, because we know what that particular is. That way, if your Charisma increases, this will automatically increase. And does it say what type of damage? It's force damage, so it'll match the damage type of Eldritch Blast itself. So you want to make sure that you match that. That is the one way to do this. Now, there's a bit of, let's say, a remembering on your part to actually go through and do this, and that is that when you cast the damage for Eldritch Blast, you'll want to click this, and you'll want to click this in order to actually do the total amount of damage that you could do. That could get a little bit complicated, and you might unintentionally forget. Well, there's a little bit of a trick with Fantasy Grounds that you can take advantage of here. So if I go through and I delete this particular action for this particular thing and modify the existing damage here when it comes to this particular spell, I could either add the stat here. So I set this to Charisma, and it will automatically add the Charisma bonus here. But you might end up forgetting that that may not necessarily be a default value of that particular spell. So it doesn't give you the option of actually just ignoring that particular capability is there. In fact, the change that I'm going to make is going to essentially force you to ignore that you're never ever going to not use Agonizing Blast. A better approach, in my opinion, is to do this and set up this as your Charisma modifier. And that gives you the ability to essentially state that this is the default roll when it comes to actually doing the damage for Eldritch Blast. This is the bonus that's being applied by Agonizing Blast. And again, this doesn't really give you the option of simply ignoring and giving you the choice of, no, I'm not going to use Agonizing Blast this time around. The previous option that I showed you does give you that option, because all you have to do is actually just click that once. You wouldn't have to click the secondary damage point. But that's kind of one of the reasons why, as a DM, I don't like this particular option, because it buries this underneath the actual spell here. I actually prefer setting up a specific Eldritch Invocation so that Agonizing Blast is clearly being shown as being used. So I like to drag this into the character sheet. And as you can see here, it already has a couple of effects, but they're for other things that are here. Now, what I like to do in this particular case is create a feature group specific for the Warlock. So Warlock. And everything gets grouped into this particular category for this. I won't be using any of these particular effects for this particular Eldritch Invocation. So I'm going to add a new action, and I'm going to add an effect. And the reason why I'm adding the effect is it's going to become clear as to the Dungeon Master as to what is actually happening here. We want to set this up fairly simply. What we want to do is provide a description of the invocation that we're using. So, Agonizing Blast. And that's a semicolon that is here. We're going to set the effect up so that we're adding damage to our roll on the next roll. And that is going to be DMG : and then we want to have a space here, an open square bracket, and we want to put in CHA to tell it that we're adding our Charisma modifier to this particular bonus. And the damage type is going to be Force. There is no duration. You're going to be adding it to yourself, and it's going to be on next action or on next roll. In this particular case, it doesn't matter, but if you choose on next roll, you're going to want to make sure you only enable this particular effect literally just prior to you rolling damage. Whereas if you put it on next action, it will be there until you roll damage. But I recommend on next roll, just so that you don't accidentally have it in place and it's polluting a roll down the road. So there is something that we can set up that makes things a little bit more convenient for us as a player. And that is that we could actually copy all of this down into here. And I'm encouraging you as a player to actually go through and do that. And the reason being is it sets everything up here in place so that you can cast the Eldritch Blast spell without having to go through and scroll back and forth along your actions tab. Because at later levels, that can be problematic. And it can sometimes get difficult to actually identify where the spell is that you're looking for, or the effect that you're looking for is. So, to show you how to do that, what we can do is this. We can go add action, and we want to set up a cast. And we're going to modify the attack feature here. Now, the attack feature, in this particular case here, is a ranged attack, because you're going through and actually making use of that particular ability. Now, where does the +6 come from? Well, the +6 doesn't come from your dexterity, it comes from your spell casting ability. So what that means is that I could go through and modify this attack feature directly so that I go, okay, it's an ability and it's going to be charisma. And now we see that we have the +6. But what happens if I go through and I set up features for all of the other things that we have here? And I'm recording this after I've added these because I've realized that it can be a bit easier to deal with this. Well, there's an easier way to go through and do this. You can actually modify the entirety of the group itself. So, by clicking on this particular magnifying glass, I can modify the entire power group called Warlock, which is what this actually is. And the group is an abilities category. So you can actually set this up for spells, abilities, and spells, abilities. That's literally all it is. The attack in this particular case is going to be with, I just totally, charisma plus proficiency plus whatever bonus. So you want to make sure that you have charisma there. And that's because everything that's in here is probably going to use your charisma as the default value, and we can simply modify the few that don't. The other thing is that there may be some saving throws that come into play. Well, if you set the group up to actually make use of your 8 plus your charisma plus your proficiency bonus, you don't have to modify them after the fact once they're added. So rather than modify this directly, I'm going to simply set this up to use the group attack. And you can see here that I get my ranged bonus because the attack feature is set up here. And the ability, in a lot of cases, is going to be charisma. So it'll set that as the default. And that comes into play typically when you're setting the type. So now that I've modified that, let's go through and add the damage. So I'm going to go through and add a new action, and it's going to be a damage roll, and it's going to be 1d10 force. All I have to do is add a new damage element here, drag the 1d10 die here, and type in force. Now, everything that I need is here in relation to being able to cast Eldritch Blast. But I'm not going to be telling the Dungeon Master, hang on a minute, what's going on here? So I'm going to modify the description here and simply add Eldritch Blast to this particular spell, or description, I should say. And that tells the Dungeon Master that Eldritch Blast is applying Agonizing Blast is applying a modification to the Eldritch Blast spell. That's what that tells us. Now, what this gives you, the player, the option to do is you may choose not to use Agonizing Blast. So you just simply come up here and cast Eldritch Blast as you normally would. But if you want to make use of the Agonizing variant of Eldritch Blast, you come down here and cast it, because when you actually make an attack roll here, you will see that the attack is Eldritch Invocation, Agonizing Blast. Okay, so that's the attack. Now, if I roll the damage, it goes through and indicates again that it's the Eldritch Invocations Agonizing Blast entry, but I didn't have my effect. So I've already hit. So let's say again I have my effect and I roll. It's going to have everything set up so that it goes through and automatically applies everything that we want. Now, granted, it's still not saying that this is Eldritch Blast. I don't see that anywhere in this particular description, but you as the player know which one is modifying. So that's really what it's for. And it probably comes down to a character limitation on this particular thing here. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. And that's how you can simplify the use of Eldritch Invocations for Agonizing Blast. Now, there are other invocations that change how a particular spell is worked. For example, this Mage Armor spell here, or Armor of the Shadows, you can cast Mage Armor on yourself at will without expending a spell slot or material component. That comes down to, well, how does the Dungeon Master know that you're going to do that? Well, you would create an Eldritch Invocation entry here and essentially give it the Armor of the Shadows tag. So in this particular case, this would be Agonizing Blast. So and I would actually remove these two particular features because they're not going to be used for the Agonizing Blast feature. I'll drop this back into place. That gives me another one. And I will minimize this one so we don't get that confused anymore. And I would call this Armor of Shadows and remove both of these effects. Because the Dungeon Master is going to want to know exactly how it is that you're casting a particular spell without using your components and why you can do it at will. See, the yourself at will, that kind of gives you the ability to potentially cast that as a reaction, or gives you the ability to cast it at any particular point in time. But you're still going to have to abide by a turn rule. So you can cast it during an action, you could cast it as a bonus action, you could cast it as a reaction, but you could not cast it if you're outside of your turn, unless it's a reaction. So if you've already gone through and run your round, for example, you've gone through and cast everything, you would not necessarily be able to cast it as a secondary action as part of an action, unless you had the ability to do two actions. But you don't run through the process of having to worry about using up a spell slot. You don't have to worry about using a particular material component for those few spells that do require them in relation to a Warlock. But you still have to abide by the rules of the combat round. So that's the limitation. Now, I won't say that that's necessarily set in stone. There are some Dungeon Masters that go, oh, you're going to do that? Yeah, sure, fine. And you can do that whenever you want. And that's just to keep the game, that particular game flowing forward. Me, I tend to be a little bit more stickler towards the rules. Just simply because bending things too far could sort of show advantage to a particular player when you're not showing advantage to other players. So by sticking to the rules, you make it an even, fair playing field. So if you decided to choose the Armor of the Shadows Invocation, you also get the spell that goes with it, because in this particular case, it's not a prerequisite. So you gain Mage Armor as a spell that you can now cast. So let's say I did take these two particular invocations, then I can now add Mage Armor to my action sheet, my spells list, because I now have gained that as part of this particular invocation. Instead of adding the Mage Armor spell here, which in this case just simply adds an AC of 3 for 8 hours, we can set this effect up within the actual Armor of Shadows invocation, if you will. And all we have to do is go through and add an effect. We want to add AC 3, but we want to add a description. So this is going to be Armor of Shadows, because that's what you're making use of, semicolon, AC of 3, and it's going to be 8 hours is the duration of this particular thing, and it's only on you. So this guarantees, actually, is it? It will, okay, so on yourself, yes. So there is a limitation to that particular capability. This way you don't accidentally put Mage Armor on somebody else, because you can do that with the Mage Armor spell, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, any willing creature who's not wearing armor. In this particular case, the limitation is that it has to be added to you. And by doing this, you set it up the way that it should be. And we can add a space here just to give a little bit of clarity for reading. Then what we can do is we can actually remove the Mage Armor spell from there so that we don't have to worry about trying to find the spells we actually want to use and have the ability to make use of here and accidentally cast the wrong one. Plus, it doesn't give you, the player, a false sense of, oh, I have all of these spells that I can make use of. when really, if you're trying to cast a spell that's using Pact magic, you still have the original limitation that comes into play. So it's best to set it up inside of the actual category for your invocation. The same thing would apply in relation to beast speech. So with this particular invocation, you gain the ability to speak with animals or cast the speak with animals spell at will. Again, that follows the same combat rules if you're in a combat situation, but you don't have to worry about expending a spell slot when you do this. So to simplify things, I'm simply going to drag this into here and simply modify this. Now, I don't need the actual effect here, so I probably could have just copied the other one. So I'm going to remove the action and simply rename this to Beast Speech. Oops, that's EE. There we go. And then I'm going to add the Speak with Animals spell to my actual Actions tab. So if you took this one, you would gain that ability. Now remember, you can only choose 2 invocations at first level. I'm going to run through and show you the ones that you can actually potentially choose at first level as part of this run through. That way you can sort of get an idea as to what you need to do to set it up. So for Beast Speech, we could potentially adjust this so that it's not in our primary spells category, because technically this is an invocation. So we really should move this to a category called Eldritch Invocation. Eldritch Invocations. And what that will do is it will set up a new category here, specific to spells that are associated with your Eldritch Invocation, so that you can actually make use of them up here. Now, theoretically, you could essentially eliminate the need to have the Beast Speech invocation here. And I would actually recommend that is a very viable option. So I'm going to remove that from here. This way, you have the Speak with Animals Eldritch Invocation, but I'm going to add in the description of Beast Speech to this. Just so that when you cast it, the Speak with Animals functionality is there, but it doesn't. It tells you where it's coming from. That way you can go look it up. In relation to the Beguiling Influence invocation, you're gaining proficiency with Deception and Persuasion skills. So you wouldn't add anything to your Actions tab. What you would do is add a copy of Eldritch Invocations to your features thing. So you would do this. No, that's not going to work. I would say you would modify this and go Beguiling. Wow, I can't spell today at all. Influence. When have I ever been able to spell in a video now that I think about it? And set that up. But I still want the Eldritch Invocation non-modified variant there. So I'm going to go to my Warlock sheet and drag this into place so that I can show the Dungeon Master that I've chosen this, therefore it's going to modify my skills, but I still have my base Eldritch Invocation skill there to be able to choose from. So I would have Deception, which in this case I'm already proficient in, but I would be able to add Persuasion. Now, it's not saying that you gain double proficiency. So just to be clear, it is saying you're gaining proficiency. It's not cumulative. That's why I did not bring this up to a double proficiency. So Devil's Sight would be another ability that you would want to simply make a copy of here. Or add to your feature sheet. So much like I did with the Beguiling Influence here, I would simply modify my Eldritch Invocations to add Devil's Sight as the actual description. And I'll just drag another one in here in case I have to do that again. And then I would go to this particular main tab here, and you'll notice that we have no senses. What this does, Devil's Sight, is it gives you the ability to see normally in darkness, both magical and non-magical, to a distance of 120 feet. Well, how do you do that? Well, what you have to do is add Devil's Sight at 120. Unfortunately, however, this will not have an effect on anything that goes along with the actual line of sight mapping or anything like that. So, mainly because of the fact that there is no mechanical link between a character's vision versus the map, which is something that I've unfortunately stated in the past, but is apparently not true. There are mods that do add vision and sunlight sensitivity to be able to potentially make use of that feature or add to that feature, but I don't know how they work within the line of sight mapping capabilities. So simply adding to the dark senses here is essentially giving the dungeon master the ability to say, yes, you can see within a darkened cave because of that particular feature. The mods make it a little bit more, I wouldn't say automatic, but a little bit more flexible to deal with. So you have to manually go through and add that at this particular point in time. In relation to the Eldritch Sight Invocation, you're essentially getting the ability to cast Detect Magic, much like you have had the ability to cast any one of these other things here. So I'm going to copy this guy instead, just add that there. So now I'll have 2 beast speeches. Interesting that it added the effects here, but I don't need the actions. So, and then I'm just going to simply change this to Eldritch Sight. And then I'm going to add the Detect Magic spell to the actual spells list here. So it's right up here now. So much like what we did with Agonizing Blast, Eldritch Sight makes use of an effect of sorts, if you will. It's really a description. There's no actual functionality, if you will, that comes with it. It just tells the Dungeon Master that it's there. So rather than leave Detect Magic up here, I would argue it would make sense to add the effect here. So I'm going to go through and add the effect into this particular section. I'm going to copy this. So this is Detect Magic. I'll leave that over there. I'm going to modify this, but I'm going to change the description a little bit. Eldritch Sight. Detect Magic. It's going to last for 10 minutes. And it's going to be on self. And this tells the Dungeon Master right off that it's coming from your Eldritch Sight Invocation and that it's coming from Detect Magic. So I wouldn't worry too much about that, but it does give you the ability to remove Detect Magic from this particular spell slot. That way you don't unintentionally use Detect Magic as a spell for your normal Warlock spells. In relation to Eyes of the Ruin Keeper, this is going to be more of an ability rather than a feature, but I would argue it could be added to the Actions tab to indicate to the Dungeon Master you're making use of it. So copy that into place, clear this out. But this skill is pretty much a role-playing skill, if you will. Eyes of the Ruin Keeper. And is actually quite useful. You can read all handwriting. That includes languages you can't comprehend. You might not necessarily understand it, but you can definitely read it. That's where this comes into play. Now, Eyes of the Rune Keeper, in my personal opinion, would be that you as a character who takes this can, in fact, understand that. So that would be the way that I, as a Dungeon Master, would allow a player to be able to actually go through and make use of it, with one exception. In relation to scrolls that could potentially cast some form of magic. Yes, you might be able to read the writing on it, but you may not be able to make use of the writing on it. It's essentially what I would put that restriction down to. And that mainly comes down to the magical aspect of a scroll versus the handwriting that you might be reading off of a normal letter of some kind or inside of a book or tome. That's all that means. So Fiendish Vigor is very similar to what we've been doing so far. and it essentially gives you the ability to cast False Life. So I'm going to delete these again. Change this to Fiendish Vigor. And then drag the False Life spell into place. And that's literally all it does, is it gives you the ability to cast it as a first level spell. So there is a limitation here. You can't actually cast it at a higher spell level, which I don't know if that particular spell can do. Yeah, you can. So there is one particular limitation. You would not be able to cast this at higher level spells without potentially expending a spell slot. With the False Life spell, though, again, you're executing something that you don't want to necessarily have to go back and forth to be able to do. So I would argue it would make sense to add the effect right to the Fiendish Vigor Warlock feature here, but leave False Life up here on the off chance that you do want to expend a spell slot in order to actually cast it at a higher level. Now, that's just in the case the Dungeon Masters are going to allow you to do that. In relation to the way that I would play Fiendish Vigor, you can't cast it past level 1. So, even though it says without expending a spell slot or material component, the restriction here is first level only, in my opinion. I would argue then that you would not be able to make use of the at higher level feature of this particular spell. So really, all you're only ever going to gain the benefit of is the 1d4 plus 4 temporary hit points. That isn't a heal per se, that is a temporary hit point gain. So, I'm going to add a new heal to this particular effect. I'm going to bring this one open just to make sure that I get everything the exact same, and it is going to be temporary. It's going to be on self. It's going to be temporary. It is going to be a 1d4 die roll, and there's going to be a bonus of 4 added to it. So, yeah, temporary hit points. This way, I don't ever have to worry about unintentionally casting this at a higher spell level if I'm playing for a DM that doesn't allow you to do that. So I'm going to simply delete this from the spells list. Plus, I can now see more clearly which spells I have the ability to make use of. So Gaze of the Two Minds is actually a kind of an interesting little invocation here. I'm going to just get rid of these. This gives you the ability as a player to peer through a willing participant's senses. This includes eyes, your hearing, sense of smells, things like that. You're essentially having the ability to gain those particular senses or make use of those particular senses. And the only restriction is that particular creature has to be on the exact same plane of existence. There's no range limitation or anything along those particular lines. There are limitations in the sense that if a particular creature that you have chosen cannot see into the dark and they have gone into a cave, you are also blind as a result of that. While you are in this state, you cannot hear, see, or smell anything around you. And it's kind of questionable as to whether you can actually feel the touch of anything. So if someone has their hand on your shoulder to signal something, that is a questionable thing. Most DMs would allow that, but to give you sort of a clue that, oh, you need to come back kind of thing. But in general, it's a 50-50. It comes down to the Dungeon Master themselves. I would allow it, in my opinion. I know there are other Dungeon Masters that would allow it. But the whole concept of Gaze of Two Minds is that you're trying to make use of many of the senses of the person that you've linked with rather than your own. So an example of this would be that, let's say you had a familiar. I don't know if Warlocks actually get a familiar yet, but let's say you had a familiar and that familiar was willing to allow you to do that, and then they flew off if they were a flying one. Well, you could actually see everything that they see, hear everything that they hear, smell everything that they smell, and get a sense of touch when they land on something or touch something. That is what that comes down to. And they could go all the way across Faerun or Eberron or Ravenloft if you happen to be in Ravenloft, and still you would be able to feel those senses, see those senses, hear things, etc., etc. You wouldn't necessarily be restricted to having to be within, say, 120 feet or 500 feet, that kind of thing. As long as they exist on the same plane of existence that you are actually physically on, you can essentially maintain that connection. You will use an action during combat to maintain that connection, and you use an action to make the disconnection and call the creature back. So that's essentially how that will work. So the Mask of Many Faces invocation is very similar to what we've been doing. We go through and we create a new copy of a particular invocation. And the reason, I'll show you the reason why I'm adding these here in a minute. Mask Many Faces. Get rid of these effects. And then drag Disguise Self into the character sheet. So it gives you the ability to cast the Disguise Self spell. And the reason I'm adding these here is the Dungeon Master could potentially ask, well, how do you have that ability? You just click this, say I'm going to use that, and drag that into place so that you can show how it's linked. So even though we've added Mask of Many Faces here, I would argue that there's a better approach even to this particular approach. And that is to make use of the Eldritch Invocation category that we did for Beast Speech. And rather than have Disguise Self here, I would say let's copy this and put it into the Eldritch Invocations grouping. So in case you didn't see that, it moved from there to here. And then I would modify the description of Disguise Self to include that it has Mask of Many Faces. So Mask of Many Faces. That way you as a player know what Eldritch Invocation it is coming from. And then we just simply delete Mask of Many Faces from here. In my opinion, the Eldritch Invocation keeps the spell category of what the spell is. It just gives you the ability to simply cast it from here rather than from it cluttering up your spells, your level 1 spells or your level 2 for some of the later stuff, all that jazz. And it keeps it a little bit better organized. So the Misty Visions Eldritch Invocation gives you the ability to cast Silent Image at will without expending any spell slots or material components. Very similar to what we've been doing so far. And once again, I would simply set up a copy of this particular feature and set it up so that it indicates the invocation that you're going to use. So in this case, Misty Visions. And then I would take the Silent Image spell and add it to the Actions tab. Now remember, you're not going to have all of these things. You're only limited to a certain number of invocations. I'm just simply adding them to the character sheet to show how easy it is to go through and set things up so that you can show that you're actually using them. Now the thing about Silent Image is it does also have an effect here, but again, it's primarily a descriptive indication to the Dungeon Master that this is in place, that this effect is in place, rather. So, oops, rather than edit, I want to edit this. I'm going to add this directly to the Misty Visions Warlock feature here. So I'm going to add in another effect. I'm going to copy this and paste that into here, and then just call it Misty Visions. Silent Image, and indicate that it is a concentrating spell. It's going to last for 10 minutes, kind of like Detect Magic, and it's going to be on self. And this way, you can just simply get rid of Silent Image from the spell grouping here, and just have this here. You don't ever have to worry about doing it. Now, it will be a little bit tricky to get back to the actual description of the spell, but as you can see, all I had to do was pop this open and then just select Silent Image, and I've got the information I'm looking for. So the next one, Repelling Blast, modifies the effects to a certain degree of the Eldritch Blast cantrip that you have. And I'm just going to reduce that. No, that's not the reduction. That is. But in a way that you can't really modify this particular Eldritch Blast at this particular point in time. So you're definitely going to want to make a copy of the invocation here and add this to this particular effect. Essentially what will happen is that when you connect and hit somebody with the Eldritch Blast, Repelling Blast will come into play and force that particular creature back 10 feet. So you're going to click this to tell the DM that I'm using the Repelling Blast invocation. Can you please push him back 10 feet? So you have to be able to remember to do that. That's the only disadvantage of setting these up as a separate invocation. Now, much like Agonizing Blast, Repelling Blast does make use of the Eldritch Blast spell. And I'd like to have the ability to not really have to flip back to the Eldritch Blast spell to be able to get at it. So I'm going to do something similar to what I did here with Agonizing Blast. I'm going to update Repelling Blast. I'm going to add a cast. And if you recall, I don't necessarily need to change anything. All I have to do is set the type to ranged, and it will automatically go through and configure that for me. I'm now going to set up the damage, and it's going to be 1d10 force. So I'm going to drag, oops, forgot to add that, drag 1d10, and it's going to be force damage, but we're not getting the bonus. We don't need to worry about adding this effect to this. And I'm just going to make sure that I have Eldritch Blast here to tell me as a player, Eldritch Blast, that is going to be my Eldritch Blast spell, and that I'm going to be using this particular Repelling Blast invocation. So rather than choosing the effect of this, I can choose this. So Thief of Five Fates is essentially giving you the ability to cast Bane once using a Warlock spell slot. You can't do it again until you finish a long rest, and this is why it makes sense to set something up like this in the Actions tab as a separate feature. So let's set this up as Thief of Five Fates. All right, and I'll drop Bane. No, I don't want Bane here. I keep forgetting that does that. Where's Bane? Bane up in here. So it's going to be a spell, and there it is there. But because this requires you to finish a long rest, and because we have set this out as a separate feature, you can now set it up as a once daily use, so that if you do in fact cast it, you have to now go through a long rest to be able to get the ability to use it again. And I will execute that long rest on this particular character. Just 1 second here. There we go. And as you can see, it is now returned. But you might ask, what about the Bane spell itself? Can you set that up as a one-time use? Well, when it comes to spells, all you can actually do is prepare them. So as long as they are prepared, and as long as you have spell slots available, you could theoretically cast them over and over and over again. The better approach might actually be to take all of these effects for Bane and move them into place in reference to the actual Thief of Five Fates. And in fact, that is actually what I'm going to do. That way we could eliminate the need to have Bane here and have it directly linked to this particular feature. So what do I actually need? Well, the first thing I'm going to need in relation to Bane is the saving throw modifier here. So in this case, it's going to be a charisma saving throw. And I'm going to want to make sure that I choose the correct proficiency skill plus the 8, or proficiency modifier plus the 8 plus my charisma bonus to be able to get the right saving throw level here. So let's go through and add that to Bane. So I'm going to add a new action. I'm going to add a cast, and it's going to be a saving throw of type Charisma. It's going to be 8 plus ability. That ability is going to be Charisma. Oops, I always go by it. I don't know why I do, but I always do. There we go. And now this particular saving throw is set up appropriately. So, what is next in relation to Bane? Well, it has an effect, and it has a duration. So I'm simply going to copy, if I can. Yep, okay. I'm going to copy this so that it is in my clipboard. It's going to be a target, and it's never going to expend. All right. So this is going to be an effect that I'm going to add to this particular spell, or feature, if you will. I'm going to put all that into there. I'm going to call this Thief. Oops. IEF of 5 Fates to give it a description. And then the functionality is going to come into play. So when this particular effect is on a particular character or creature, the Dungeon Master is going to know what Eldritch Invocation applied it and what the effects are actually going to be, and that you as a player have to maintain concentration on this particular ability because it's a concentration spell. And I just want to confirm the duration is 1 minute. So the duration is 1 minute. And that moves everything that would be associated with this particular spell down into the actual power. And it gives us the ability to eliminate having this particular spell there. And we could easily do that for all of these spells that we're going through and setting up here. I simply like having the spell here just for simplicity. It does add a bit of complication because you then have to click this, and then you have to go back up and actually click the actual spell that you're casting. So it could be argued that you can go through and set everything up here. Now, having said that, Eldritch Invocation, now when I go to use this, I go, okay, I'm going to trigger a saving throw. So let me actually target, let's say this ape, for example. I'm going to trigger a saving throw on that ape. They're going to roll. They're going to succeed. In this case, this doesn't come into play. I'm going to roll again next round. Success. I'm going to roll again next round. Wow. Success. I'm going to roll again next round. Finally, we got a failure. Now I can apply the effect to the ape, and we can't see the effect in this particular case, but I do. Yep, it is applied on the ape, so it is there. I do see it on the side of the thing, and actually we do see it here, so it is there. I was looking at the Warlock for some stupid reason. Anyway, so we can see that it is here. Now, you have to maintain a concentration, and its round is 10, or sorry, its duration is 10 rounds, which is equal to 1 minute. So as long as you concentrate for a full 10 rounds, that effect will remain in place. And it tells everyone who's involved that it's Thief of 5 Fates, which means it's associated with your invocation. So it's a very descriptive way to go through and do that. So one of the tricky bits about invocations is that they're hard to track. You need to recall how many you've actually gone through and used. And when we break all of these out into the individualized invocations like we've done here as part of this example in this video, you're going to very easily lose track about that, or of that. So an easier way to go through and do this is to use the process we developed later in this particular video and move most of the functionality that is here up into this Eldritch Invocations section for your spells. And then have one Eldritch Invocation here that has a preparation daily use counter. So, for example, at level 20, which is what this character is, I could use that particular Eldritch Invocation 8 times daily. And if we see here, we now have a counter set aside for 8 uses. And then the functionality that we've defined here could simply be added to the Eldritch Blast that we throw in here. That is a better way, in my opinion, that we could go through and do this. And it's something I probably should have done while I was running through the video, but I didn't think about it until after I had recorded everything. So that's the reason why I'm inserting this now, is to show what we could actually do. And you will see later on in this video that I change how most of these Eldritch Invocations are stored. Instead of creating individual invocations here, I'm throwing most of them here. And that is all that we have to do. So theoretically, we could just simply get rid of this and just call it Eldritch Invocations and keep a preparation use, and then tick this to indicate that we've used it, and then go up to Eldritch Invocations and use the individual invocation that we want to use. So that would be a more effective way to do this. And I'm just going to undo that for now. And that covers all of the invocations that you as a player have available to you by the time you hit level 2. Now let's check to see if there's anything else that we have to do at level 2. Well, we now need to ensure that we have another spell. So I can now choose a spell of my choosing, or of my own choice here. And it's got to be a level 1 spell. So I'm going to get rid of the cantrips thing there. And I'm going to take Witch Bolt. And it gives me a combat spell that I can now make use of at level 1. And as you can see, it's quite powerful. If I'm not mistaken, it's actually one of the more powerful level 1 spells that you can cast. And that does, in fact, complete everything that we need to do for level 2. In relation to 3rd level, we're going to gain the Pact Boon feature. In addition to knowing one additional spell, but this time we can now set it up as a level 2 spell, as opposed to it just being a level 1 spell. We're going to still only have 2 actual spell slots. And I do believe this bounces around a little bit, so I want to set this up. So keep an eye on this particular Pact Magic spell slots thing here. We'll see what happens. And nothing else really changes. So I'm going to drop level 3 into place. So let's go there, and then let's immediately check to see what happens to our Pact Magic slots. You will notice that we no longer have 1st level Pact Magic slots. That doesn't mean you can't cast 1st level spells that you already know as 2nd level spells. So there is a correction that I have to introduce in relation to how Warlock spellcasting does in fact work. I've gone back and I've reread the rules for spellcasting in relation to a Warlock. And the correction is that you can in fact cast a lower level spell utilizing a higher level spell slot. The only benefit that comes into play is if that spell happens to have the ability to take advantage of that, you'll be able to increase the effects of that particular spell. So I apologize for the confusion I introduced on that. I will make sure that this section gets included in the portion of the video where I cover that. But that's how the spell casting for a Warlock works. And it's a bit different because Warlocks, as you can see here, I have 4 5th level spell slots at level 20. That's what this particular Warlock is right now. But there are no level 1, level 2, level 3, or level 4 spell slots in play anymore. You only get a total of 4 spell slots, plus features that allow you to make use of these 4 spell slots a little bit later on, before having to have a long rest. You don't gain any, or you don't keep any of the earlier spell slots. Your spells are always increasing in the damage that they do. So, for example, Hellish Rebuke here, at higher levels, will do an additional 1d10 point of damage for each slot above 1st. So that would be 4d10 points of damage that you could do. But when it comes to something like, let's see here, Misty Step, it doesn't have the ability to take advantage of that. So you're literally going to be burning a 5th level spell slot to execute Misty Step to be able to jump around. That is how that works. So let's go through and take a look at Pact Boon. Where'd that go? There it is. The Pact Boon feature is essentially where you receive your gift from your patron. And whether that's the Archfey, the Great Old One, or whatever fiend you have chosen to put your pact with, it gives you a bit of a benefit as a result. And there are 3 different types of pacts that you can actually choose. Or gifts, I should say. Pact of the Chain, Pact of the Blade, or Pact of the Tome. In relation to Pact of the Chain, you are gaining the ability to have a familiar. And it functions very similar to the way that the familiar spell or feature does in reference to other classes, except in this particular case, you can choose the form of that particular creature without having to have any form of cost factor involved. So when you cast the Find Familiar spell, you can choose at that point in time what that particular creature is going to return as. So it could be, in the case, it could be an imp, it could be a pseudo dragon, quasit, or a sprite, or whatever you want to do, but it's got to be something that is linked to your patron. So chances are, in relation to the Archfey, it could be a pseudo dragon or quasit, but in relation to a fiend, it's most likely going to be an imp or something else, so on and so forth. Those kinds of things. The other thing that can happen is that if you do have a familiar, you can choose to forgo an action of your own during a combat round and have your familiar make that action. So the two can't go at the same time. They don't attack. You don't operate as separate entities in this particular case. You or your familiar make the attacks if you're going to do that. You don't both get the actions. So there is a limitation there when it comes to that. In relation to Pact of the Blade, you are essentially gaining the ability to cast forth a weapon at will, or take a weapon that you already own and convert it into a pact weapon so that you can bring it forth and send it away at will. When you do that, and let's say for the example of purposes with this particular character, we chose a quarterstaff, you have to take an hour to more or less cast a ritual on that particular weapon to be able to convert it into a pact weapon. And at the termination of that ritual, the weapon will disappear and it gives you the ability to call it back and forth. And it's just as solid as if you had been holding it in your hand with a physical weapon. In addition, if you take a non-magical weapon, such as our quarterstaff, and you convert it into a Pact of the Blade weapon, it now becomes magical in relation to the types of damage that it can go through. So it will overcome resistances for those creatures that require a magical weapon to actually hit them. So your weapon will still hit, and it's a good way to work around that problem. It doesn't mean, however, that you are stuck with that weapon. You can actually go through and cast another ritual on that particular weapon to remove it from your pact and add in a new one. Add in a new one that you have gained over time. The weapon itself doesn't lose any bonuses to damage it has. So if you had a +3 sword, for example, and you converted that into your pact weapon, it maintains that +3 bonus to the damage. You're just giving yourself the ability to call it forth, as opposed to having to worry about sheathing it every time, or bringing it out of the sheath when you wield it. So that's what you get the ability to do. However, if you drop that weapon and it is more than 5 feet away from you for more than 60 seconds, it will disappear. If you are knocked unconscious or die, it will disappear. Those kinds of things come into play, so you have to be careful of that. But because it's a pact weapon, if you die and you're resurrected, you can just simply call it forth again. So it's not like you lose it. And it doesn't matter where it was dropped. It will simply disappear and you can call it forth again. Those are the kinds of things that you can do with Pact of the Blade. So Pact of the Tome, on the other hand, is essentially a spell book that you're gaining that will contain 3 cantrips. And as long as you're holding that tome, you can cast those cantrips at will. You don't have to worry about the requirements of having components or anything along those particular lines. You still have to follow the rules of combat when it comes to casting spells. So it's not an at-will where you can cast all 3 cantrips in one particular round or scenario in this particular case. But it gives you the ability to make use of those cantrips without having to worry about anything. Now, cantrips generally they don't have material components or semantic casting requirements, but in this case, you're no longer having to do anything other than think about the spell and it's cast. That's literally all it comes down to. As long as you're holding the book. Much like the Pact of the Blade, if you drop the book, it will disappear. If you lose the Book of Shadows, you can perform a 1-hour ceremony, if you will, and receive a replacement from your patron. So they're essentially granting you a book of theirs and giving you these particular spells. These cantrips do not count towards your total cantrip count, so you can add them to your actions tab and be able to make use of that. And that's literally all that particular Pact of the Tome does. In all three cases, the Pact will be related to your patron. And as you can see on screen here, the description of your Pact Boon here is essentially allowing you to describe the appearance of that particular weapon in relation to the patron that you have chosen. So you'll want to go through and review that and then come to a decision as to what it is you want your weapon to look like, or what you're familiar to be, or what the tome should be described as, those kinds of things. Now, other than those particular features, the Pact doesn't really do much more, but it does tie into your Eldritch Invocations. I don't know if you noticed it when we were going through it, but some of the restrictions that came into play were related to pacts. So if you look at here, Book of the Ancient Secrets, it was going to require you to have the ability of having Pact of the Tome. In this case, it would be if you had chosen Pact of the Tome for your Pact Boon. So let's go and have a look as to what Pact of the Boon changes in relation to your Eldritch Invocations. So with Book of the Ancient Secrets, you are now able to take 2 first-level spells of your choice and copy them into this book, much like it would be a spell book in this particular case, on one condition, that they have the ritual tag associated with them. And it gives you the ability to cast those spells while you're holding the book as a ritual spell, and you don't really need to worry about it from that perspective. But how do you identify what spells have rituals? Well, you can go to the Spells tab here, and you can see here that there is a ritual selection. You can actually change that to yes, and by default it is blank. I don't know why it was set to no. Must have been something from the previous session. And when you set it to yes, it will list all of these particular spells that have the ritual tag associated with it. And then you can go through and just open it up. So it has to have ritual here, and it will tell you a duration. And then you can copy this into your spellbook. The good news is that the reason why you can do this, or the benefit you're gaining from the ability to do this, is it doesn't restrict it to a Warlock spell. And you may have noticed most Warlock spells don't even have the ritual component to them. They're meant to be instantly cast, or cast within one action. So that is something that allows you to expand your repertoire of spells and be able to add them to the book. You can also add additional spells to it at a later point in time. So when you choose the Eldritch Invocation is when you get your first 2 spells that you can add to it. Later on, if you find an additional ritual scroll, for example, or a spell that's on a scroll that is a ritual, you can transpose that into your book, and it will take approximately 2 hours to do, and it will cost you 50 gold pieces for the rare ink you need to actually go through and do it. So it gives you a way of actually adding spells to your repertoire over time. That way the book isn't necessarily just 3 cantrips, and away it goes. So that's what Pact or Book of the Ancient Secrets will actually do in relation to Pact of the Tome. But there really isn't any need to add either of these, the Pact Boon or the Eldritch Invocation, to your Actions tab. It's literally just a feature flag that comes into play. You would, however, go through and potentially add the spells that you're going to add to that particular book into your Actions tab, and I would argue that you should go through and create a category of Pact of the Tome and call it Book of Shadows, for example. So you would say change this to a Book of Shadows, although you wouldn't do that for this. But whatever spells you select from that should go into that particular grouping. That way it's not mixed up with your normal spells or your cantrips that you can cast, and because they're going to be ritual spells, you're going to need to take the time to do them, which means it takes the time to actually cast them, which is generally 10 minutes to an hour, depending on the type of spell. So, Voice of the Chainmaster gives you the ability to essentially communicate through your familiar. So you could bring your familiar forward, and instead of using just a person that happens to be in your party to examine and see the senses through, you can now do this with your familiar, and the same policy applies in that as long as they remain within the same plane of existence that you are on, you can see or hear or smell through the senses that they have. But this particular invocation also gives you the ability to speak through that particular familiar. And even if that particular familiar is normally not able to speak, so you could theoretically take let's say a cat, if you've decided to go that particular direction, and now you have a talking cat or a talking pig or whatever choice of creature you've chosen for your familiar. And that may be applicable if you went with the Great Old One, because you can have any familiar you want for that. And that's really what Voice of the Chainmaster does. Again, this isn't necessarily an actionable invocation, but you can go through and add it to your Actions tab in this particular case. And I'm not going to do that in this particular case, because you should know how to do that by now. And I will leave how you go through and do that up to you. Now, Pact of the Blade doesn't give you any invocation at level 3. It does a little bit later on, I think at 5th level, if we can see that there, Thirsting Blade. And we'll cover that when we get to 5th level. So with that, we have now covered everything that we really need to worry about in relation to Pact of the Boon. So the last thing we have to do before we move on to level 4 is choose a spell. And in this case, I'm going to go to a 2nd level spell here. Let's have a look here. I'm going to call the select Misty Step and just drag that into place. So now we have Misty Step in place. In relation to level 4, we are going to acquire an ability score improvement as well as an increase in our known spells. We're also going to have no change in our spell slots, but we are gaining an additional cantrips that we will know. So we can go through and choose a new cantrip. Nothing else really changes. And the gain in relation to the Warlock is the ability score improvement. So let's go and apply this particular level here. And I'm going to take care of the cantrips and the spells first. So let's go back to actions. Let's select the cantrips. And what do I have so far? I have Blade Ward and Eldritch Blast. Let's go with Mage Hand. All right, and in relation to the spells, it's still 2nd level. And how many spell slots do we now have? So we now have 2 2nd level spell slots. We're not getting an increase there. So let's add Ray of Enfeeblement. Okay. And now let's take care of the ability score improvement. The ability score improvement gives you the ability to do one of 3 potential things. 2 are pretty much guaranteed. 1 is going to be entirely dependent on the Dungeon Master themselves. In relation to the first 2 things, first 2 options that are guaranteed, you have 2 choices. The first one is going to be that you can take 1 ability score, and that's your strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and or charisma, and modify that 1 ability score by 2 points. Your second guaranteed option is that you could take 2 ability scores and modify each of them by 1 point. And you can only do one of those 2 things at a time. You can't go, well, I'm going to take strength and add 2 points to that, and then take intelligence and constitution and add a point to each of those. That's not how this works. It's an either or. But it's a guaranteed either or in this particular case. The third option is going to be completely dependent on the Dungeon Master and whether they allow feats to be used in their campaign. Some Dungeon Masters do not allow feats to be used. It's an optional rule. Feats are essentially additional features that you can add to your character to give your character additional abilities. So, for example, Ritual Caster could change how you cast rituals. In this particular case, Sentinel gives you the ability to intervene in certain combat conditions, stuff like that. So these are all things that will come into play as you level your character up. And typically it's every fourth level, so 4, 8, 12, so on and so forth, when you actually get this ability. In most cases, you will have a dungeon master that will allow you to do feats. But in a lot of cases, that option just simply won't exist. So it's going to be entirely dependent on the campaign. Some DMs see them as overpowered. I'm on the fence. Either way, they add a little bit of interest to the game, in my opinion, at the same time of giving the player a bit of a, oh, I'm feeling really good about this kind of thing. But at the same time, they do add a level of, oh crap, now I need to take that into account when I'm designing campaigns or when I'm running through campaigns, things like that. It can sometimes make a campaign be a little bit too simple. So, for this particular example, I'm going to take one ability score and increase it by 2 points. And if you've watched any of my other videos, you will have seen me do that in the past. And I'm, in this particular case, going to add 2 points to my charisma. And you may have noticed something. So if you look here, I had a 15 to start. I'm now making the modification to a 17. And the modifier value here is increasing. Well, that means I am now missing hit points. And what do I mean by missing hit points? Well, I'm level 4. I just added a +1 to my Constitution bonus, which means I'm missing 4 hit points from this particular character. So I can now bring that up to a 35. Now, you're going, wait, that math, how does that actually work? Essentially what it is the difference in the modifier change here, which in this case is just 1 point, is multiplied against the level your character currently is after you have leveled that character up. So not prior to leveling up, but after you have executed the level up, because that's when you gain the ability score improvement. And that covers everything that we need to worry about at level 4. At level 5, we are seeing an increase in our proficiency bonus. We are not gaining any new features. We are not seeing an increase in our cantrips. We are gaining knowledge of an additional spell. And we are not gaining any additional spell slots, but we are essentially gaining the ability to use 3rd level spells at this point. In addition, we are seeing an increase in the total number of invocations that we now know, which means how many we can actually use. So let's go ahead and drop the level into place. And there we go. So in relation to our proficiency bonus, there's nothing we need to do. It's just literally going to be an increase to our proficiency. Everything else that is already flagged as proficient is going to benefit from that change, in addition to our attacks. So we don't need to worry about that. Any spells here that have been set up, so if we take a look at our Warlock group here, we should see that our proficiency options are there. Anything that triggers a saving throw, or anything that triggers, let's see, Bane, I believe, 5 feats here, if I'm not mistaken, added a saving throw. Yeah, we should now see that that saving throw has now increased. So all of those changes are now done for us. We don't need to worry about it. And that's one of the beautiful things about Fantasy Grounds. In relation to the cantrips, no change. In relation to spells we know, let's go to a 3rd level spell. And you may have noticed that Fireball is not here. Fireball is not typically a Warlock related spell. It's typically wizards, things like that. So I am going to add a 3rd level spell here. And let's see. Let's see here. This is going to be a bit of a tricky one. I'm going to take Dispel Magic. It's always useful. Although, actually, no, I'm not, because I already have the ability to cast that spell right now. I'm going to delete that. I'm going to cast Fly. Who knows? Maybe I want to fly around for some reason. But there is something that we do need to go through and take a look at. And that is going to be our Eldritch Invocations. Because some have now unlocked at level 5. So one of the first ones is Mire of the Mind. And again, this is going to function very similar to Thief of Five Fates in the sense that it's going to allow you to cast slow once using a Warlock spell slot. So you do have to have a Pact magic spell slot available to you. And you will require a long rest in order for you to actually be able to use it again. So let's take a look at the slow spell. With slow, it's going to essentially slow that particular individual down. It takes a -2 penalty to AC, so on and so forth. So I'm going to do something here to make things a little bit easier. I'm going to add a new copy of this particular ability here. I'm going to drag this into place. And you'll notice that it copied the settings that I had for the Thief of Five Fates. We can get rid of those because we're going to most likely change these. Delete that. Yeah, okay, good. So leave that as is. I'm going to change this to... Get rid of that. Mire the Mind. All right, that's going to throw that up there. And you'll see that we've already got the preparation and rest settings already in place, which is why I copied this particular feature. I'm then going to drag slow into here. And what it should do, if I'm not mistaken, is add a whole pile of effects here. However, I am not going to change anything in relation to this particular spell. And here's the reason why. With Mire of the Mind, you are going to still be casting a spell with the use of an actual spell slot. So, if you have no spell slots available to you, you should not be able to cast Mire of the Mind. What that means is that everything that is level 1 through, let's set this to combat, 1 through 3 in this particular case, should not be available to you if you've used both of your spell slots. And that's what actually happens here. So you see that spells levels 1, 2, and 3 go away. That's what we want. But we still want to show the Dungeon Master that we're using this, and we still want to be able to remove the ability to cast this particular feature or make use of this particular invocation without having the ability to have had a long rest, that kind of thing. So that's why I'm separating these two out. And you'll have to remember that when you actually make use of it, but this is why it logically makes sense to keep those two separate. So the next one that becomes available is One with the Shadows. And what this allows you to do is essentially if you're in an area of dim light or darkness, you can essentially become invisible. Now you may remember that when we dragged this particular group into place, or feature into place, it had an invisibility capability there. Now I want to be able to make use of it. So this is now a Warlock. And this is going to be for One with Shadows. I'm then going to remove the necrotic element from this particular thing, and now we have the invisibility effect already there. So I can now simply make use of this particular feature. We don't need to worry about doing anything else. Now the last one that unlocks for us is specific to our Pact of the Blade, so will only be available to anyone who has chosen Pact of the Blade as an option. And what this gives us the ability to do, it's called Thirsting Blade, and you can attack with your Pact weapon twice instead of once, whenever you take an attack action on your turn. So it essentially gives you the ability to execute an extra attack. That's what that allows. So, nothing really needs to be done when it comes to adding an effect here. We don't need to, a feature here, because we don't need to make note that we're using it. We're just saying, well, actually, I suppose you could actually drag it into place and put it into place. So let's go ahead and do that, now that I think about it. That is not where I wanted it to go. So let's change this to Thirsting Blade. and then set this down as Warlock. Now we don't need any of these two features here, so we don't need the actions. And that gives us the ability to say I'm attacking with my weapon twice. And we can just do that. So I suppose it does make sense to add it in this particular case, so I'll correct that. And that is everything that we need to worry about when it comes to the Eldritch Invocations, and in fact, that completes everything that we need to deal with for level 5. In relation to level 6, we will be gaining our first Otherworldly Patron feature, which I'm not going to worry about covering in this particular video, because those will get covered in the video specific to the patrons. The only real change for us in this particular video is that we're gaining a new spell that we can study. So I'm going to minimize that. And it can be a 3rd level spell. So before I do anything, I'm going to drop this level into place and gain an additional spell here. So for now, I'm just going to cast Vampiric Touch, or add Vampiric Touch. And that's it. That's everything that we have to do from a basic Warlock perspective for level 6. For level 7, we are essentially gaining the ability to know an additional spell. And we're now moving our spell slots up to 4th level spell slots. In addition, we are gaining a 4th invocation. So, a few changes here. Let's go through and add that. I'm going to unlock a... Let's go with Blight. So that'll give us our 4th level spell. We are not changing anything else in relation to that, except our spell slots have now moved up. So at level 7, we do unlock some additional Eldritch Invocations. The first one is Bewitching Whispers, and this gives you the ability to cast the Compulsion spell once using a Warlock spell slot. You can't do this again until you finish a long rest. So it's going to be very similar to what we have done with our other Warlock spells. So I'm going to minimize this, expand this. I'm going to copy this guy here. Actually, you know what? I'm going to copy this one and drag it into place. So that's the Mire one. Oops, I didn't want to modify. I'm going to delete these effects, and then I'm just simply going to update this to be Bewitching Whispers. Okay, now much like the Mire the Mind ability, I'm simply going to drag and drop Compulsion into place. This does require the use of a spell slot, which means I don't want that spell to be available, which should be level 4, if we have burned through our spell slots. So if I put it at combat, we should see that none of our spells are available now that I've gone through and used all the spell slots. That's what we want to have happen here. And that's exactly what we need for Bewitching Whispers. The next one that unlocks is Dreadful Word. And that gives you the ability to cast the Confusion spell once while using a Warlock spell. So again, we're going to want to do the same thing. So let's copy Mire of the Mind. Why are you unlocked? Must have kept that change. I'm going to delete these actions. And change this to Dreadful Word. All right, so that sets that up, and now I'm going to drag Confusion into place. And it falls under the same rules that we want to make sure that we have a long rest and that we want the spell to go away if we have no spell slots. The last one that unlocks is called Sculptor of Flesh. And it follows the same rules of all of the other spells that we have been adding in the last little while. So we just want to make sure that we copy, say, one of these, modify it to be Sculptor of Flesh. That's going to bring that down here. We're going to remove these, I should say. There we go. And then I'm going to drag the polymorph spell into place. And that should add it there. Yep. Okay, good. Okay, and that's all the ones that we unlock at level 7. And that completes everything that we have to do for level 7. At level 8, we are gaining our next ability score improvement in addition to our knowledge of an additional spell. Nothing else changes. So let's drop our level into place. I'm going to take care of adding, let's say, Dimensional Door. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to modify one of these abilities by 2 points each. So let's bring, let's see here. I'm going to bring my intelligence up 1 to cancel out that negative value there. And I'm going to bring my wisdom up 1 as well. And it does not change any bonuses, so I don't need to worry about that. That's everything that you have to do for level 8. In relation to level 9, we're seeing an increase in our proficiency bonus. We are gaining 1 additional known spell, and our spell slots are now moving up to level 5th, and this will be the last time that our spell slots move up. We are also gaining an increase in our invocations. So let's drop this into place, and then go down and pick out a 5th level spell. Let's go with Hold Monster. However, at 9th level, we do also unlock some Eldritch Invocations. The first one that we could potentially make use of is Ascendant Step, and that gives you the ability to cast Levitate on yourself at will without expending any components or spell slots. So that functions very similar to many of these other issues, but because there is a spell component into place, I'm probably going to drop that into Eldritch Invocations here. So if I take Levitate and drop that into here, we can now see that it's automatically grouped into Eldritch Invocations, and we've got everything here. We don't need to worry about adding an actual grouping down here for this particular spell. The next one we unlock is Minions of Chaos, and this gives you the ability to cast a Conjure Elemental spell by using a spell slot, and you will require a long rest. So we want to use the same method we've been using for things like this. So let's open this up, drag and drop. And you'll notice that I'm doing that because it automatically adds it to the Warlock group for me. I don't need to worry about that. And that only works with things that have already been grouped. It does not work for things that are not yet grouped. So this will be a Minion of Chaos. Minions of Chaos. And then I'm going to simply drop the spell into here. And it should drop into level 5. So I'm going to minimize 4. And that's everything we need to set up for Minions of Chaos. We also have the ability to use Otherworldly Leap. And much like our levitation ability, we can now cast Jump on ourselves without expending any material spell slots or anything like that. So I'm simply going to drag Jump into there to indicate that I'm using it as an Eldritch Invocation. And that's all I have to do. We don't need to actually go through and set up any Warlock reference or anything like that. The last one we unlock is called Whispers of the Grave, and it gives you the ability to speak with the dead at will without expending any spell slots. So again, this falls under the same concept of our jump and levitation capabilities, and gives us the ability to cast Speak with the Dead. And once again, we don't need to add any group category to this. It's already there. So we're done. And at that point, that is everything that we have to do for level 9. At level 10, we're going to gain our next Otherworldly Patron feature, which again will be covered in future videos. We do not gain an increase in known spells, and we do not gain any other change except cantrips, so we do gain a new cantrip here. That's the only thing that we're going to be gaining here other than our Patron feature. So let's drag and drop level 10 into place, go down to here, and scroll this up so that we get back to our cantrips. So I have Blade Ward over in that. Let's go with True Strike. And that's everything that we have to do for level 10. At level 11, we're gaining a new feature called Mystic Arcanum, and it has this 6th level category next to it, and I'll explain that here in a bit. We are gaining another known spell. We are now gaining a third spell slot, so we are finally seeing an increase in our spell slots here. This is why Warlocks can be classified as underpowered when it comes to spellcasting things and whatnot. We are not gaining any increase in our level. In fact, we will not gain anything higher than 5th level spell slots going forward, so we don't have to really worry too much about that. We are also not seeing an increase in our invocations. So let's go through and drop this into place. So let's select the main tab, drop our level into place, and pop open the new feature that we have gained called Mystic Arcanum, which is down here. And I will set that right there. When we gain Mystic Arcanum, we are essentially gaining the ability to unlock higher level spells. You may have noticed that our spell slot level does not go any higher than level 5 according to the leveling table. And that's intentional. That's required. That is something that is set up that way intentionally. But we also have to have the ability to go through and gain access to spells that are obviously available to us, as you can see with the Warlock spells listing, because there's level 6, 7, 8, and 9. Well, Mystic Arcanum gives us that ability. Now, there are some rules to it. You can only cast one spell, and you can only choose the level that's indicated within the actual table there. So at level 11, it's a 6th level spell that we can choose, and that's what is implied by the brackets around the name. So I'm going to go through and add our first spell. Let's go Circle of Death. And as you can see here, it's going to drop it into a spells level 6 grouping. Well, there are some issues. The problem with this is that our restriction is we can use it once and that's it. Well, that makes it more of an ability or feature than of a spell. So I want to actually go through and set this up slightly differently. I'm going to move this to the Mystic Arcanum group. So let me just Mystic Arcanum. I should be saying Mystic Arcanum, not Mystic Arcanum. And I want to try to see what happens when I change this. So that is now showing up as an ability. Perfect. That's what I want. So with that, I can now switch this to preparation and set up how many times I can actually use this. That is now our limitation. So now if I use that, it goes away. Well, what happens if I go through and execute a short rest? So let's open this up on the DM screen and say short rest. Doesn't return, does it? Nope. Okay. Let's go in long rest. Now it's back. Perfect. That's exactly what we want. So you don't want to leave that particular spell in the spells categorization here that you see here. And if we were to even change any one of these particular groups to be a abilities group, it will change all of these spells to be that. That's not what we want either. So we have to create a new group to be able to get the organization and the ability to use and not be able to use it again until we get a long rest through that whole process. But here's the thing. The save on this particular spell is actually kind of wrong. And the reason for that is because, it's set up to use the group attack feature here, or settings. Well, we haven't gone through and set up our group settings for anything in here. Let's go through and do that now. So our ability is going to be Charisma. We want base plus Charisma. No, we want Charisma. There we go. And our saving throw is also going to be Charisma. So we essentially want to change these 3 boxes to Charisma. Now you can see that our DC has changed. This is what it should be. Everything else is ready to go, so we don't need to do anything else. Now, whenever we gain any new Mystic Arcanum spells, we can drop them into this particular grouping, and they will stay there, and then we can go through and set them up by the preparation rules that we need to go through and configure them for. Now, I still need to choose the spell that I can now learn. So let's go back up to level 5. Oops. And let's add scrying. Kind of useful always, generally. Okay, and that's everything that we have to do for level 11. In relation to level 12, we're gaining an ability score improvement. And that is almost it, except we are gaining an increase in our invocations that we know. Nothing else is really changing here. So let's go ahead and drop level 12 into place. Okay, now, in relation to an example for a feature, I'm going to go through and actually, select one of these abilities that are here and add it into the actual character here. So I'm going to take a second, look through what I want, and then I'll be right back. Well, one of the things that we could potentially take advantage of as the charlatan background is a feat called Actor. This gives us the ability to increase our charisma score by 1 point, although it won't increase our bonus, I don't believe, at this point. But the benefit here is it gives us the ability to gain advantage on charisma on deception and performance checks whenever we're trying to pass ourselves off as a different person. Well, that's kind of what the whole role of the charlatan does. There are other benefits that we can gain as well, in the sense that we can mimic the speech of another person or a sound made by other creatures. However, you must have heard that sound for at least 60 seconds and have made a sort of a decent attempt at trying to mimic it. A successful wisdom or insight check contested by your charisma deception check allows a listener to determine whether the effect is fake or not. So this is something that we could add to our actions tab as a result. So let's go ahead and add this to our abilities. So let's go to feats. Let's drop this into place here. Done. At the same time, I'm going to add it to our actions tab here. And it's going to be under the charlatan groupings where I'm going to put it, even though it's a feat. And in this case, I'm going to make sure that feat is flagged. So what can we add here? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to increase our charisma by 1, which it has already done for us. So we don't need to worry about that. Excellent. Automation. Love it. Now we have an advantage on charisma and deception checks. So, is there anything that we could do here? Well, there's an effect that we can add to this that will give us the advantage. So let's go through and add advantage. We'll set this up as an ability score. This will be for actor, semicolon, ADV CHK is what we want. Actually, no, we want skill, now that I think about it. We then want to go with a colon there, and we want deception, comma, performance. And what this will do is it will add an effect to us that if we're making a deception or performance roll, it will give us an advantage to that skill check. It's going to be on self, and it's going to roll or expire on the next roll. Now all we have to do is whenever we're about to roll one of these checks, we simply add this effect to ourselves. So how does this actually work? Well, what you would do is before you roll the actual skill, you will go through and simply make sure that this effect is added to you. But you need to add it to yourself, and that's already done. That's where the self comes into play. Perfect. If we check the combat tracker, we'll see, well, I don't need that there anymore. We'll see that we have an advantage to a skill check. Now all I have to do is actually roll my performance, and you'll see that it rolled twice. For those of you who are unable to see the color green, you'll want to look over here towards the advantage ADV keyword here. If you're not getting an advantage or disadvantage roll, it will appear, this won't appear here, I should say. You'll see DIS for disadvantage and you'll see ADV for advantage. Those of you who are not colorblind to green we'll notice that this die is now green. That's because it rolled with advantage. In this case, I rolled a 25. Well, what does that now mean? Well, this applies to the third section of this particular actor feat. Essentially what it means is that the person now has to roll an insight check and hit a number higher than 25. So it's not something that we can actually add here as an action, because you'd be dynamically changing this every single time. You need to go through and essentially set something up that when you make a roll on this particular deception roll, they now have to counter and exceed 25. In this particular case, if I roll it again, so if I go with an advantage roll and I do another deception check, now they have to exceed a 27. So you can see how the advantage roll almost guarantees that this is going to work. And that latter part only comes into play if you're actually trying to mimic the speech of another person. Generally, if you're going through as a disguise, you're probably going to be trying to do that anyway. With 12th level, we are in fact gaining another invocation that we could potentially make use of, called Lifedrink. When you hit a creature with your Pact weapon, the creature takes extra necrotic damage equal to your charisma modifier. So, this will only apply to anyone who has chosen Pact of the Blade. And what that means is that all we have to actually do is drop our invocation into here. And that'll show up here. This will be a Warlock. We can delete the invisibility feature with this one. Add in the name, Lifedrink. And then set the group to Warlock. And everything else is set up for us. We don't need to do anything else. And that completes everything that we need to do for level 12. In relation to level 13, we're gaining our next Mystic Arcanum spell level, which is going to be a 7th level spell in this particular case. We are gaining an additional spell known for our other spells. And that is pretty much it. Anything else that we can justify an increase of. We are seeing an increase in our proficiency bonus, but there's really not much we need to worry about there. Okay, so let's go ahead and drop this into place. That's level 13. Let's take a look at a level 7 spell. Go back to our Actions tab here. So let's go with Finger of Death. Now, oops, that's not where I wanted it. One moment. Let's reduce that and maximize that. I did delete the right one, did I not? Yes, I did. Okay, good. All right. So the one thing about spells is you can automatically drop them into a group here, and they will always automatically benefit from that when it comes to these things. Oh, and we can also set up a default one daily use. So you'll see that it automatically modified that. This way we don't have to worry about setting up anything here anytime we add something into here. So anytime we drop a spell into this grouping, all of this will be set up for us. We don't have to worry about doing anything else. This just simplifies that functionality for us. Now what about the actual spell? Well, we don't necessarily have to choose a level 5 spell. We can go back and choose an earlier spell. And in fact, I'm going to do that with this character. I'm going to... What do I have for level 3? I'm going to go with this one. Okay, and that is actually everything we need to do for level 13. At level 14, we are gaining our third Otherworldly Patron feature, which will be covered in the Patron video, so I'm not going to cover that here. And that is literally it. That's all we're going to be gaining here. So I'm just going to drop level 14 into place. And that's all we have to do. For level 15, we are unlocking our next Mystic Arcanum spell capability. We are seeing an increase in our known spells, and we are seeing an increase in our invocations. Everything else is remaining the same. So let's drop level 15 into place. And then go and take a look at a level 8 spell to drop into our Mystic Arcanum section here. Let's go with power where it's done. And as you can see, it's already set up for use, and it's already configured our saving throws, so we don't need to worry about that. Now, in relation to our spell, oops, I keep doing that. Let's go with, what do I have for level 4 spells? Light, Dimension Door, and Polymorphism. Let's go with Banishment. With level 15, we are gaining the unlocks of a couple of invocations here as well. So, Chains of the Carceri gives us the ability to make use of an additional invocation for those who have taken Pact of the Chain feature. Or Pact of the Chain, I should say. With this, you now have the ability to cast Hold Monster at will, targeting a Celestial Fiend or Elemental without expending a spell slot or material component. You do, however, need to complete a long rest before you can use this invocation again. So, what do we need to do to go set that up? Well, we're going to make use of our Eldritch Invocations grouping here. We're going to simply drop Hold Monster into this grouping. We are then also going to modify that Hold Monster to be a 1 daily use, because it's a long rest that you need. And that gives us the ability to cast that as an Eldritch Invocation. It's a little different from what I've done earlier in the video, but I think we found a better way to do this overall. So a lot of the things that we have down here inside of the Warlock grouping, probably could be moved up into that. And that takes care of Chains of the Carceri. Another invocation that we unlock is called Master of Myriad Forms. And this gives us the ability to cast Alter Self at will without expending any spell slots. Well, that's easy. We just drop it into our Eldritch Invocations grouping here, and we're done. We don't need to do anything else. The next invocation that we unlock at level 15 is Visions of Distant Realms. And that gives us the ability to cast the Arcane Eye spell at will without expending any spell slots. And much like we did with our previous invocations, all we have to do is simply drag and drop this into place in here, and it will automatically take the effects and configurations that our group is set up to use. And the last Eldritch invocation that can be unlocked is called Witch Sight. And this is also handled at level 15. And in fact, level 15 is the last level we unlock any additional invocations. You can see the true form of any shape changer or creature concealed by illusion or transmutation magic while the creature is within 30 feet of you and within the line of sight. So this isn't a spell, this is literally an invocation. So what this means is that we do need to add this to our Actions tab in order to tell the Dungeon Master that we're going to be making use of this. And we do that by simply grouping this into this section here. And I'm just going to simply copy this guy here. And that was Repelling Blast. This is going to be called Witch Sight. And I'm going to get rid of these two effects. And that's it. That's all we need to do in order to set up Witch Sight. Okay. So that is everything we have to do for level 15. At level 16, we are gaining our second to last ability score improvement. And that is pretty much it. So let's go ahead and drop level 16 into place. And in this particular case, I'm simply going to increase Charisma by 1 point to that. And I'm going to bring Wisdom up by 1 point to push its bonus up some. So we don't need to worry too much about that anymore. I think that increased, did it not? No, it did not. Oh yeah, it did. Okay, so yeah, we're good. Okay, and that is everything we need to do for level 16. At level 17, we are gaining our last Mystic Arcanum spell level, which will be level 9. We are seeing an increase in known spells, and that is almost everything. There's actually an increase in our spell slots taking place here, as well as our proficiency bonus, and this will be the last of both of those. So let's go ahead and drop this into place. Level 17. Let's go down to level 9 and choose our Mystic Arcanum spell here, which will be Power Word Kill. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. And is there something it didn't do? Okay, cool. Again, I get the unlock thing. And then our actual spell. So level 2. I don't think I had a whole lot in the way of level 2 spells for this particular character. No, I did not. Let's do Cloud of Daggers. That does damage. Okay. And that's everything that we have to do for level 17. So at level 18, the only thing that is going to change is our level, the total hit points we're gaining as part of our level, and the fact that we can now use 8 invocations between rests. That is all that is going to change. So I'm just going to drop that level into place because there's nothing that we have to do. Level 19 is going to see our final ability score improvement and our final known spell become available to us. So let's drop this into place. And in this particular case, I'm going to bring up my intelligence 2 points to finally gain everything with a plus bonus of some kind. The last thing I'm going to do is choose a level 2 spell, and I'm going to use Ray of Enfeeblement. So I'm just going to drop that into place there. And now I can close that. And that is everything that we have to do for level 19. At level 20, we are gaining our last feature, and that is going to be Eldritch Master. So let's drop this into place first. And then let's go have a look at Eldritch Master and see what this gives us. So with Eldritch Master, you are now essentially gaining the ability to beg your patron to give you back all of your spell slots without having to worry about a rest. You have to literally pray to your patron for a 60-second period of time, and at that point, you will regain all expended spell slots. So in this case, that's 4 spell slots. This is an actionable feature because you will not be able to do that again until you complete a long rest. So this will pretty much be the last of our Warlock ability. So I'm going to drop this into the Warlock category. Obviously, it's not going to go there right away. Warlock. And it is going to be Eldritch Master, which should be down here at the bottom. And that requires a once per day use, 1 daily. And that sets it up. That is all that we have to do with Eldritch Master. This will get used. When it gets used, it becomes unavailable until you complete a long rest. And that gives you the ability to recover 4 of your spell slots, so all 4, between rests. So you can essentially cast 8 spells now before you have to complete a long rest, before you can regain the ability of actually gaining the ability to cast 8 spells. So that is what Eldritch Master gives you. And that, in fact, completes everything that we need to do for the basic Warlock. And I hope I will see you in the next videos that cover all of the various patrons that we're going to go over. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this video. I wish to thank you for taking the time to watch this particular video. I hope you found it informative and useful to familiarizing yourself with Fantasy Grounds in general, and that you had fun in the process. If you found the video useful and you liked the content of the particular video, go ahead and click that like button to let me know. And if you have any questions specific to the topic covered by this particular video, or just have some comments in general, please feel free to post something in the comments section, and I will do my best to respond to any questions that are asked. Additionally, I do release content quite regularly, and it's generally specific to Fantasy Grounds or 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons at this time. So if you'd like to be notified when new videos come out, go ahead and subscribe and click the notification bell to ensure that notification is sent to you when I release a new video.